This story is actually a response to a prompt that was posted on the sub writing prompts on Reddit. So here's the prompt. Unbeknownst to us, every time a child makes a wish, a star is formed. Only when the wish is granted does the star explode. One day, all the stars in the sky suddenly disappear quietly. Do you remember what you were like when you were younger? Elaine sat by his side, her hands clasped around his. He was close now, and the doctors could do nothing for him. Nick chuckled, and even that small action caused him to cough again. He took in another ragged breath, even as Elaine looked at him worriedly. I was a mean little bugger. Got into everyone's business. One day I cut up all my neighbors' petunias. My ma beat me fierce after that one. His eyes glazed, as if he were transported back to that moment. She smiled at his response, but it felt forced. They had been together for 50 years now, and she had never known him as anything other than kind, so she loved hearing stories about what a menace he'd been at the age of 2, letting her see a side of him she never got to see, even if he stopped remembering that he had told her. She reached out and brushed a strand of gray hair out of his face. She had no reason to complain. They'd had a good run together. It was everything she could have hoped for, and more. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then he gasped for breath, and the beeping from the machine beside the bed got louder. Elaine stood up, the chair making a screeching sound as it dragged against the floor. I'll get the doctor, she told him, flustered. He grabbed at her hand. Don't. She looked back, and she was frozen. He had a peaceful smile on his face, and it reminded her of when they were 17 again, when they would look at the stars together along the riverbank, and she would be looking at the sky, and he would be looking at her. He told her he'd only made one wish his entire life. She believed in God. He didn't. So that one time he made an exception and willed himself to believe. He wished that he could pluck all the stars out of the sky for her. She had laughed at him then, saying that God would find his wish frivolous and that they weren't children anymore. We're all children at heart, he'd said with a serious expression on his face. She had simply laughed and gotten up from the grass, dancing out of his reach. His entire body was racked with coughs. Elaine felt tears threaten to fall, but she knew she couldn't cry. He hated to see her cry. He took another breath. Do you think God will grant my wish? She laughed, just a small one, but it was enough to make him smile too. His grip on her hand began to loosen, and even before the beeping from the machine turned into a single tone, she knew. One tear fell, then another. Don't cry, he said. His eyes were twinkling again, in that way she once said made her feel like he was Mary Poppins, like he could hold the world under his umbrella. I hate to see you cry. Then his eyes shut, and Elaine let herself cry. She cried for him, for the man who had had the last years stolen from him, forced to lay in a hospital bed. She cried for herself, for the girl who had just lost the love of her life, and she cried for the world, who would eventually forget about him. The world remembered men who invented medicines and traveled to the moon. It didn't remember men who stood outside in the dead of winter, handing out scarves and gloves to passerby. It didn't remember men who always bought extra meals for those sitting at the street corner, even when he himself didn't have enough to eat. She looked out the window, and maybe it was the tears that were blurring her vision. Maybe it was just her willing it to be true. But the stars flickered. In that vast, empty sky, for just a brief moment, there was nothing but darkness.